A life saved, a future unwritten. Dr. James Lawson had long ago come to terms with the solitude that had become his companion. The quiet of the world around him, once filled with the bustle of hospital rounds, patient consultations, and medical triumphs, now seemed far too loud in its stillness. It had been 5 years since his beloved wife, Rachel, passed away after a lengthy battle with cancer. The grief, though softened with time, had left an indelible mark on his heart. There were moments, still, when he could almost hear her laughter echoing through their empty house, or imagine the warmth of her hand in his as they walked through the park together. But those moments were fleeting, and as the seasons passed, James found himself sinking deeper into the quiet ache of loneliness. As he strolled along the winding park path, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, James' thoughts were far from the beauty around him. The trees, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, shed their leaves in graceful spirals, the autumn air carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen foliage. But none of it reached him. His heart felt heavy, burdened by regrets and the haunting question of what could have been. He often wondered how different his life would be had Rachel survived, if they had been able to build the family they dreamed of. A house full of laughter, children running through the halls, and dinner table conversations that stretched long into the night. But now his home felt like a cavern of memories, every corner shadowed by the absence of the life he had once imagined. James had always been a man dedicated to others, pouring his energy into his patients and the medical profession. It was his way of coping with the emptiness, of filling the spaces where his dreams used to live. But on that particular evening, as the world around him glowed with the soft warmth of sunset, something pulled him from his reverie. It was faint at first, a soft, almost imperceptible sound on the breeze. His gaze shifted upward, his thoughts momentarily interrupted. He listened intently, unsure whether the cry had been real or a trick of his mind. Another faint wail reached his ears, sharp and desperate, sending a chill through his body. James turned instinctively, his heart racing as his medical instincts took over. A baby. Here. He scanned the area, his eyes searching for any sign of the child's source. The sound seemed to be coming from a nearby bench, tucked away in a quiet corner of the park. James hurried towards it, his feet crunching the fallen leaves beneath him as he approached. When he reached the bench, his breath caught in his throat. There, wrapped in a faded blue blanket, lay a small, helpless infant, no older than a few days. The child's skin, dark as the richest mahogany, contrasted starkly against the pale cloth. The baby's tiny body trembled with the chill of the evening air, and its cries grew more insistent as James knelt beside it. His heart surged with a strange mixture of compassion and disbelief. How could someone leave such a small, defenseless child alone like this? James gently gathered the baby in his arms, cradling it against his chest as he whispered soothing words, trying to calm its frantic wails. The baby's face was contorted in discomfort, but it seemed to calm slightly in the warmth of James' embrace. He glanced around, but the park was eerily empty. There were no signs of anyone nearby, no clues as to who had left the child or why. "You're going to be okay," James whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring the baby or himself. His mind raced with the questions that immediately sprang to life. Who would leave a child here? Why? And what would become of this tiny life? James didn't hesitate for a second. He had taken an oath as a doctor to preserve life, to heal, and this baby, abandoned and vulnerable, needed him. Without a second thought, he began to walk briskly toward his car, the baby still wrapped in his arms, its small head nestled against his shoulder. He had to get the child to a hospital. Fast. As he drove, he couldn't help but wonder if this was fate, if he had been in the park at the exact moment the child needed him most. The thought lingered in his mind, though he quickly dismissed it. He was just doing his job, he reasoned, just another patient to save. At the hospital, the staff worked quickly to stabilize the baby. Dr. Lawson remained by the child's side, his hands trembling slightly as he helped administer the necessary treatments. It was then that he first noticed the child's eyes, dark and searching, filled with a quiet wisdom that seemed far beyond such a small infant. James couldn't explain it, but in that moment, something inside him shifted. This child, this tiny, vulnerable soul, had somehow come into his life, and he couldn't let go. Not yet. As the doctors and nurses worked to ensure the baby's survival, James found himself reflecting on his own life. He had been alone for so long, and yet, in the span of a few hours, his life had been irrevocably changed. He had always wanted a family, a child of his own to love and care for. But after Rachel's death, that dream had seemed impossible. He had buried those hopes deep within himself, unsure if he could ever love again, let alone raise a child. But now, as he stood there, watching over the small infant in the hospital's neonatal unit, James couldn't ignore the pull in his heart. He wanted to give this child a future. He wanted to be the one to help this baby grow, to watch him thrive, and become someone who could make a difference in the world. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to dream again. It wasn't long before the child was out of danger, though he remained in the hospital for observation. During that time, James visited every day, spending hours at the infant's bedside, watching over him as though he were his own. He named the baby Elijah, a name that had come to him in the stillness of the night, inspired by the prophet known for his strength and perseverance. In those early days, Elijah's survival was nothing short of a miracle. But to James, it was more than that. It was a second chance, a chance to rebuild the family he had lost, and to become the father he had always longed to be. As weeks passed, James began the process of formally adopting Elijah, though he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Raising a child, particularly one with no family, no history, no past, would come with its own set of challenges. But James was determined. He had been given this opportunity, and he wasn't going to waste it. He would raise Elijah with love, care, and guidance, teaching him the values of kindness, compassion, and resilience. In the years that followed, Elijah became a bright light in James' life. He was everything James had dreamed of, curious, kind, and full of life. Elijah's laughter filled the house, and the sounds of him running through the halls replaced the silence that had once consumed James' home. And though James couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness when he thought about the child's past, he also knew that what mattered most was the future they would create together. But even as they formed this new life together, James couldn't forget the mysterious circumstances that had led to Elijah's arrival. Who had left him there in the park? Why had they abandoned him? James would never know the full story, but he had come to terms with the fact that Elijah's past, though important, didn't define him. What mattered was the love they shared and the future they would build. And so, as the years went by, Dr. James Lawson found himself not just the doctor who saved a life, but the father who had been given a second chance, a chance to shape the life of the child who had unknowingly saved him from the grief and loneliness that had consumed him for so long. For the first time in years, James felt complete, and though he knew the journey ahead would be filled with its own challenges and heartache, he was ready, because sometimes life doesn't go as planned. But that doesn't mean it can't turn out beautifully. The child's name. As the years unfolded, Dr. James Lawson's life took on a new rhythm, a rhythm dictated not by the quiet solitude he had known for so long, but by the presence of the boy he had come to love as his own. Elijah, now 6 years old, filled their home with an energy that James had not known he had been missing. His days began with the sound of Elijah's laughter, echoing from the kitchen where he could be found, sometimes up to his elbows in flour as he tried to help make breakfast. James couldn't help but smile as he watched the boy's enthusiasm fill the room. The house, once eerily silent, now buzzed with life. The walls that had once seemed too large for a single man now seemed just the right size for the two of them. James had given up his old routines, spending his evenings alone with books and cups of tea, and replaced them with family dinners and bedtime stories. In these small moments, he had found what he thought he had lost forever. Elijah had grown into a curious, kind-hearted child, full of questions about the world. He was keenly aware of the love James had shown him, and though he was too young to fully grasp the complexities of his past, there was an undeniable bond between them. The boy often asked questions about his origins, though he didn't seem burdened by them. It was as though he trusted James with his whole heart, believing that this man, who had raised him with tenderness, held all the answers. One evening, after finishing a dinner of spaghetti and meatballs, Elijah plopped onto the couch beside James, his small hand tugging at his sleeve. "Dr. Lawson," Elijah began, his voice tinged with the curiosity of youth. James looked over at his son, his heart swelling with pride. "What is it, Eli?" Elijah fiddled with the edge of his napkin, his brow furrowing as though he were trying to find the right words. "I was wondering, why did they leave me in the park? My real mom and dad, I mean." James froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The question was one he had been dreading, and yet he knew it was inevitable. He had always promised himself that he would tell Elijah the truth, but he had never anticipated that the time would come so soon. He set his fork down slowly, his mind racing as he searched for the right words. "Elijah," James began, his voice soft but firm, "there are some things in life that we don't always have answers to. People sometimes make choices that we don't understand, and those choices can hurt others. But I need you to know that I found you because I was meant to be your dad. It wasn't an accident. And no matter what, you are my son. I love you, and I will always be here for you." Elijah nodded slowly, as though absorbing the weight of his words. "But do you think my real parents loved me? Or were they just bad people?" James hesitated, choosing his words with care. "I don't know what happened in their lives, Eli. But I do know that you are not the sum of anyone's mistakes. You are smart, kind, strong, and above all, you are loved. Your mom and dad, the ones who brought you into this world, may have made decisions that led them to leave you, but that doesn't define who you are or who you will become." Elijah's eyes brightened, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "I guess I'm lucky then, huh?" James chuckled, feeling the tight knot in his chest loosen. "Yes, you're very lucky. And so am I." But even as the conversation seemed to draw to a close, James couldn't help but feel a flicker of guilt. He hadn't told Elijah the whole truth. He hadn't told him about the mysterious details that had emerged in the years since he found him, about the biological parents who had never come forward, the unanswered questions that continued to linger. And though James had raised Elijah as his son in every sense of the word, he couldn't deny the pang of uncertainty that gnawed at him whenever he thought about Elijah's past. Days passed, and Elijah continued to grow, his inquisitive nature unfolding like a flower in bloom. He excelled in school, his mind quick and eager to absorb new knowledge. He loved sports, particularly soccer, and could often be found in the backyard, practicing his kicks and running drills with James cheering him on from the sidelines. James could hardly believe how much his life had changed in such a short time. Elijah had brought him a kind of joy he thought had slipped through his fingers forever. But there were moments, quiet moments, when James would find himself staring out the window, lost in thought. He had become a man of routine, but there was a deep undercurrent of unease that never quite left him. What had happened to Elijah's parents? Why had they abandoned him? And what, if anything, could he do to help Elijah find closure? One afternoon, as Elijah worked on his homework at the kitchen table, James sat down across from him with a cup of coffee. He studied the boy's face, watching as he furrowed his brow in concentration. "Hey, Eli," James began, his voice tentative. "Do you remember anything about when you were little, before I found you?" Elijah glanced up, his eyes wide with surprise. He shook his head, the innocent expression on his face almost too much for James to bear. "No, Dr. Lawson. I don't remember anything. I only remember when you brought me home from the hospital, You've always been my dad." The simplicity of Elijah's words hit James hard. In the eyes of his son, he was the beginning and the end of everything that mattered. Elijah had never known another father, never questioned the love and care James had given him since that fateful day in the park. And yet, there was still a part of James that couldn't let go of the past. He didn't know what it would mean for Elijah to learn the full story of his birth, the reasons behind his abandonment, or even the possibility of finding his biological parents. As the years passed, Elijah began to ask more questions about his roots. One day, just before his 10th birthday, he asked James if they could look for his birth parents. He didn't seem upset, but there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes, a longing for answers that had been building for some time. "Do you think we could find them, Dr. Lawson?" Elijah asked, his voice almost tentative. James took a deep breath, setting his coffee cup down. "I don't know, Eli. I don't have all the answers, but we can try. If you want to search for your real mom and dad, I will support you. But I need you to know that no matter what happens, I'm your dad. I will always be here for you." Elijah smiled, his expression brightening with the reassurance. "I know, Dr. Lawson. You've always been my dad." But even as the words left Elijah's lips, James couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to take a turn he had never anticipated. The more Elijah questioned, the more it became clear that the truth about his past, about who he truly was closer than either of them could imagine. The truth, it seemed, was waiting to be uncovered, and the answers Elijah sought might not be as simple as he had hoped. The secrets unfold. The search for answers began quietly, in the soft glow of a Saturday morning. James had always prided himself on being methodical, a trait that had served him well in his medical career. But when it came to Elijah's past, nothing felt simple or straightforward. The question of Elijah's biological parents, the people who had left him in the park all those years ago, haunted him in ways he couldn't quite explain. He had tried, countless times, to push the mystery to the back of his mind, focusing instead on raising Elijah with all the love and care he could give. But the truth, as it often does, refused to stay hidden. Elijah, for his part, had been patient. He asked questions when he felt it was right, but he never pressed James too hard. His trust in his father, his only father, was unwavering, but the child's curiosity was a natural part of growing up. As he approached his 10th birthday, Elijah began to ask more frequently about the family he never knew. James could see the change in his eyes, the subtle longing for something elusive, something more than what he had been given. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, James found Elijah staring at the family portrait hanging on the wall. The photo, taken when Elijah was just 3, depicted the two of them at a family picnic. Elijah, with his big smile and unruly curls, sat on James' lap, his arms wrapped around his father's neck as they both looked toward the camera. The happiness on their faces was unmistakable, a moment frozen in time. Yet, as Elijah traced his fingers over the frame, James could sense the growing restlessness in him. "What's on your mind, Eli?" James asked, his voice soft. Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the picture for a long time, his young face shadowed with a seriousness that belied his years. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Dr. Lawson, I've been thinking a lot about them, my real parents." James' heart skipped a beat. It had been months since the subject had been brought up, and though he had always known it was only a matter of time before Elijah would ask again, hearing it aloud still hit him with the force of a freight train. He put down the book he had been reading and met Elijah's gaze. "You don't have to worry about that, Eli," James replied gently, but his voice wavered slightly. "I'm your dad, and nothing is going to change that. You're my son." Elijah looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. "I know you're my dad, Dr. Lawson, but I just want to know where I come from. I want to know about the people who gave me life. I don't want to forget them, even if they aren't part of my life anymore. James took a deep breath, feeling a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how deeply Elijah's questions had begun to take root. The boy had spent so much of his young life surrounded by love and stability that it was easy to forget the unanswered questions that lay beneath the surface. But they were there, silently growing, waiting to be addressed. "I understand," James said softly. "It's important to know where you come from, and we'll find out together, okay?" Elijah nodded, a look of relief washing over his face. "Thanks, Dr. Lawson." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. James reached out to every agency, every contact he could think of, trying to dig up information about Elijah's origins. He worked tirelessly, tracking down any records that might offer a clue as to who had left Elijah in the park that day. It wasn't easy, and the process was slow. Official records had long been sealed, and there were few leads, but James refused to give up. Elijah deserved answers, no matter how elusive they seemed. During this time, Elijah continued to thrive. His natural curiosity took him to new heights in school, and his relationships with his peers blossomed. His teachers spoke highly of him, and James was proud to see how well-adjusted and confident Elijah had become. But the boy never stopped asking questions about his birth family. The questions were often casual, posed as if they were part of the everyday conversation, but there was an underlying depth to them. Each time they were raised, James found himself retreating inwardly, unsure of how much to reveal, unsure of what was best for his son. One evening after dinner, James sat in his study, going through the latest set of documents he had received from a private investigator. He had exhausted all other avenues: police records, social services, and even hospital birth records, but nothing concrete had surfaced. But the investigator had managed to track down a few old leads, including a name that James had seen before: Sylvia Jenkins. The name meant nothing to him at first, but as he read through the file, he felt his pulse quicken. Sylvia Jenkins had been a social worker who had been involved in the case when Elijah was found abandoned in the park. According to the notes in the file, Sylvia had tried, unsuccessfully, to contact Elijah's biological mother. She had made several attempts to locate her, but the woman had disappeared without a trace. The only clue Sylvia had was a handwritten note left with the baby. A note that simply read, "Take care of him." James' stomach twisted as he read the words again. It was so simple, so devoid of explanation. Who had left Elijah? And why? Had they been in danger? Were they trying to protect him from something? James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There were so many questions, and so few answers. Determined to find out more, James contacted Sylvia Jenkins. After a few weeks of phone calls and emails, he managed to arrange a meeting. Sylvia was now retired and living in a small town a few hours away, but she agreed to meet with him. James knew this might be his only chance to uncover the truth. He had to learn what had happened, even if it meant uncovering painful truths. When the day of the meeting arrived, James found himself nervously pacing in his office. He tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting back to Elijah, wondering what the boy would think if he knew the truth. Would it hurt him to learn the circumstances of his abandonment? Would it change how he saw his life, his family? At the meeting, Sylvia Jenkins was kind and open, but her eyes held a sadness that James couldn't ignore. She had been deeply affected by the case all those years ago, and the weight of the mystery had never quite left her. "I remember that day like it was yesterday," Sylvia said, her voice heavy with emotion. "We did everything we could to track down Elijah's parents. I tried to find them, but there was nothing. No phone number, no address. The woman just disappeared." James nodded, absorbing the gravity of her words. "Do you know anything about her? Anything at all?" Sylvia hesitated before answering. "There was one thing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if it's significant, but I've always wondered about it. The woman, she had a necklace, a small silver pendant. I remember because she was wearing it when she left Elijah in the park. It had a symbol on it, like a crescent moon and a star inside. I don't know what it meant, but it stuck with me. James felt his heart race as the description of the pendant lodged itself in his mind. The symbol, the crescent moon and star, it seemed so familiar, but he couldn't quite place where he had seen it before. Could this be the key to unlocking the mystery of Elijah's past? Or was it just another dead end? The meeting with Sylvia gave James more questions than answers, but it also reignited his determination. He had a new lead, however small, and he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. The search for Elijah's past was far from over, and James knew that, whatever lay ahead, he would face it head-on. For Elijah's sake, for his son. But what James didn't know, what neither he nor Elijah could have imagined, was that this search for answers would soon lead them down a path they were not prepared for. And the truth they were about to uncover would change everything they thought they knew about family, identity, and love. Unraveling the past. James had never been one to shy away from challenges, but as he sat in his office, surrounded by piles of notes and files, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to something he wasn't prepared for. The small clue Sylvia Jenkins had given him about the pendant, the crescent moon and star, lingered in his mind. He had searched through countless databases and historical records, hoping for some connection, but nothing seemed to fit. The symbol was unique, too specific to be ignored, yet it remained a mystery. James couldn't help but feel the weight of the task before him. He had always told Elijah that they would uncover the truth together, that they would face whatever came their way as a family. But the more he dug, the more uncertain he became about what the truth really was. Could the answers they were searching for be more complicated than he had imagined? Was the life Elijah had built with him in danger of unraveling? A week after his meeting with Sylvia, James found himself on a plane, heading to a small town just outside of Nashville. It was the location of a distant relative of Elijah's biological mother. He had received an anonymous tip that a woman by the name of Margaret Jenkins, a cousin to Sylvia, might have some knowledge of the pendant, or perhaps of the family history that had been obscured for so long. It was a long shot, but James had learned to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that this was the next step in the search. As the plane descended toward the small airport, James felt a sense of both anticipation and dread. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but the journey was about to take him into uncharted territory, both physically and emotionally. He had no idea how far back this story went, or what secrets lay buried in the past. But one thing was clear: the truth was coming to the surface, and there was no turning back. Margaret Jenkins lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of the town, nestled between rolling hills and patches of dense forest. When James arrived, he was greeted by a kind but weary woman in her late 60s, with silver hair pulled back into a loose bun and eyes that had seen too much. She invited him inside, and they sat together in a small, cozy living room, where the faint smell of lavender hung in the air. "I didn't expect anyone to come looking for me," Margaret said, her voice soft, but laced with an underlying sadness. "It's been so many years." James nodded, trying to suppress the growing unease in his chest. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but I'm looking for information about someone named Sylvia Jenkins. She was a social worker involved in a case many years ago. I believe she might have been related to you." Margaret's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Sylvia's name, and James noticed the subtle shift in her expression. It was a look of recognition, but also of reluctance. "Sylvia," Margaret said slowly, her hands resting in her lap. "She was my cousin. I remember her well. But I have to warn you, Dr. Lawson, this is not a simple story. There are things that happened, things I don't talk about. It's complicated." James felt his heart rate pick up. "I understand, but I'm trying to find answers for a boy named Elijah. He was found abandoned as a baby many years ago. I believe Sylvia might have known something about his family, about where he came from." The mention of Elijah's name seemed to resonate with Margaret, her eyes softening with a mixture of empathy and sorrow. She stood up and walked over to a shelf, where she pulled down an old photo album, its edges worn and frayed. She opened it slowly, turning the pages with a reverence that spoke of the years that had passed. "This is a story that goes back a long time," Margaret said, her voice low. "And it's one I wish I didn't have to tell. But you deserve to know the truth." James leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he listened intently. He could feel the air between them growing heavier, charged with the weight of the secrets that were about to be revealed. Margaret began to speak, her voice shaky at times but unwavering, as she recounted the history of the Jenkins family. "Sylvia and I were close when we were younger. We were like sisters, always in and out of each other's lives. But things changed when Sylvia's sister, Naomi, became involved with the wrong people. She had a troubled past, and it only got worse when she fell in love with a man named Marcus Williams." James felt his pulse quicken at the name. Marcus Williams. Margaret nodded gravely. Yes, Marcus was a complicated man. He was charming, but there were rumors about his connections to some unsavory people. He wasn't someone you wanted to cross. Naomi and Marcus were inseparable, and before long, she had a child, a baby girl, who they named Alina. Sylvia always worried about Naomi, but she couldn't pull her sister away from Marcus. It was like a drug she couldn't escape. James leaned in, his breath shallow. "What does this have to do with Elijah?" Margaret's eyes clouded over, and for a moment, she seemed lost in thought. Naomi and Marcus were living in the city when Naomi got pregnant with another child. This time, it was a boy. But they got out of hand. Marcus was getting deeper into his connections, and Naomi became fearful for the safety of her children. She was convinced that Marcus would hurt them if he found out she was trying to leave. So she made a decision, one that tore her apart. James felt a deep ache in his chest. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but the revelation was too much to process all at once. What did she do? Margaret paused, her eyes fixed on the floor as though the memory was too painful to bear. She left the boy in a park, knowing he would be found. She left him there with nothing but a note to protect him, to keep him safe from Marcus. It was her only way out. James felt his stomach churn. "The boy is Elijah, your cousin's son." Margaret nodded solemnly. "Yes, Naomi never got to see Elijah grow up. She disappeared, leaving him behind with nothing but that note. And Sylvia, as you know, took it upon herself to try to track down Naomi, to find out what happened, but she never could. Naomi was gone, and Marcus, he was a dangerous man. Sylvia tried to keep Elijah's story quiet, to protect him. But now, it seems, it's time for the truth to come out." James sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had just learned. He had always known that Elijah's story was shrouded in mystery, but he hadn't imagined it was a tale of danger, escape, and the lengths a mother would go to in order to protect her child. Naomi's love for Elijah had been undeniable, but it had also been wrapped in a web of fear, and in the end, it had cost her everything. "I can't believe it," James whispered. "I've raised Elijah all these years, thinking that he had no one left. But now I know that he had a family, a history, and it's so much more complicated than I ever imagined." Margaret's voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, Dr. Lawson. This isn't the ending you wanted, and it's certainly not the one Elijah deserves. But the truth is, you've given him something far more precious than anything he could have found with his biological family. You gave him love, and a chance at a future." James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He had given Elijah everything he could, his love, his time, his protection, and Elijah had flourished in ways he had never thought possible. But now, with the truth coming to light, James couldn't help but wonder how this revelation would affect Elijah. Would he feel betrayed? Would he want to search for his biological family, or would he still see James as his father? As the conversation wound down, James stood up, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the journey was far from over. There were still unanswered questions, about Naomi, about Marcus, and about the future of Elijah's family. But one thing was certain. The truth was no longer a distant, abstract idea. It was real, and it was about to change everything. As he left Margaret's cottage, James felt the weight of the pendant symbol in his mind, the crescent moon and star, two halves of a story that had only just begun to unfold. The path forward. James's heart pounded as he left Margaret Jenkins' cottage and stepped into the early evening air. He had learned so much in the last few hours, more than he had ever expected, and far more than he felt ready for. The weight of the truth was pressing down on him, making each breath feel heavier, each step uncertain. He had come here seeking answers, but now that the truth about Elijah's biological mother, Naomi, had been revealed, everything felt like it had shifted beneath his feet. Naomi had left Elijah behind, fearing for his safety, and with no other way to protect him from the dangerous life she had been trapped in. She had made the agonizing decision to abandon her son in the hopes of giving him a better life, one free from the terrifying grasp of Marcus, the man who had held so much power over her. It was a decision that no mother should ever have to make, but it was one Naomi had made with love in her heart, even if it had torn her apart. But now Elijah had everything. He had a family who adored him, a father who had sacrificed so much for him, and a future full of promise. Yet James couldn't shake the feeling that this truth, however painful it was, would change things between them. Elijah had the right to know where he came from, to understand the legacy of his past. But James couldn't help but wonder if knowing the full story would cause more harm than good. The drive back to the city was long, and James's mind never stopped racing. His thoughts bounced from one revelation to the next, from the shock of hearing about Naomi's tragic past to the mystery of Marcus and the haunting possibility that Elijah's life might be in danger once again. The man who had been a shadow in the background of this story was far from gone, and James couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of dread. What would happen if Marcus found out about Elijah's survival? What lengths would the man go to in order to reclaim the child he had once abandoned? By the time James arrived home, it was late. The sky outside was dark, the stars barely visible through the haze of city lights. He walked into the house, a quiet emptiness settling around him. Elijah was upstairs, as he always was at this hour, reading or finishing his homework. It struck James then how normal everything had seemed for so long, despite the storm raging beneath the surface. They had built a life together, a family bound by love and trust. But now, that foundation was being tested in ways James hadn't imagined. Upstairs, Elijah's door was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling into the hallway. James paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He didn't know how to approach this conversation. There were so many layers to the truth, layers that, for Elijah's sake, had to be revealed. But how could he explain the weight of it all? How could he give Elijah the answers he deserved without shattering the world they had built together? He knocked softly on the door. "Come in," Elijah's voice called from the other side. James pushed the door open and found Elijah sitting on his bed, surrounded by books and scattered papers. His eyes lit up when he saw his father, a warm, eager smile spreading across his face. The innocence of the moment made James's heart ache. Elijah had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that his whole world was about to be turned upside down. "Hey, kiddo," James said, forcing a smile despite the heaviness in his chest. Elijah looked up from his homework. "Hey, Dr. Lawson, how was the trip?" "It was fine," James replied, sitting down on the edge of Elijah's bed. He looked at the boy, his son, the one person in the world he loved more than anything. "Actually, there's something important we need to talk about." Elijah's face grew serious, a subtle shift in his demeanor. "What's up?" James paused, gathering his thoughts. This wasn't going to be easy. "You know how we've been talking about your biological family, about your past." Elijah nodded, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot." "Well," James said slowly, "I've learned a few things, and I think it's time you knew the truth." About your mom. About where you came from." Elijah leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What do you mean? I thought you said you didn't know anything about her." "I didn't. At first," James replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been trying to find answers. And what I found, well, it's not easy to hear." He took a deep breath, looking Elijah in the eyes. "Your biological mother, Naomi, she left you in the park that day because she was scared. Scared for your safety. There were people in her life who were dangerous. People who could have hurt you. Your mom loved you more than anything, but she had to let you go to keep you safe." Elijah's eyes widened in shock. "What? You mean she didn't want me?" "No," James said firmly, shaking his head. "She wanted you. More than anything. But she had no choice. She was running from a man named Marcus, someone who had hurt her, someone who was dangerous. And she didn't want you to be a part of that world. She thought that if she left you behind, you'd have a chance at a better life." Elijah's face was unreadable, his hands frozen in place. "So, she just left me." James's heart clenched. "I know it's hard to understand. But she made that choice out of love. She didn't want to drag you into a life full of violence and fear. She thought if she gave you up, you'd be safe. She didn't have the strength to keep you with her, not with what was going on in her life." Elijah was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching James's face for some sign of reassurance. "But what about you, Dr. Lawson? Why did you take me in? I mean, I was just a baby, and you didn't even know me." James's throat tightened, and he placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, feeling a deep sense of love wash over him. "I took you in because you were meant to be mine, Eli. From the moment I saw you, I knew I couldn't let you go. I knew I'd do anything to protect you. You're my son, and I'm your dad, no matter what." Elijah's lips trembled as he absorbed the weight of his father's words. "But what about my real family? My mom and Marcus?" James let out a long sigh. "I've been trying to find more answers about them. But Marcus, the man your mom was trying to escape, he's still out there. And I don't know what he might do if he finds out about you." Elijah looked down, his eyes clouding with confusion and fear. "So, I have a real family, and they're dangerous." "I'm not sure yet," James said gently. "But you're safe here, with me. And nothing is going to change that. No matter what happens with your past, you'll always have a place with me. You'll always be my son." Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared down at his hands, his mind racing with the new reality he had just been given. James could see the questions in his eyes, the same questions he had asked himself 1,000 times. Who was Elijah, really, and where did he truly belong? "I don't know if I'm ready for all this," Elijah said softly. James smiled warmly. "You don't have to be ready. You don't have to have all the answers right now. We'll take this one step at a time. And whatever you decide, whatever you feel, I'll be right here, with you." Elijah nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "Thanks, Dr. Lawson." James's heart swelled with love as he stood up. "Always, Eli, you're my family, and that's all that matters." As he turned to leave the room, he felt a bittersweet mix of emotions swirling within him. He had given Elijah the truth, but it was a truth that carried with it a burden. The boy he had raised, his son, was no longer just a child of circumstance. He was a child of a past, a history that had been hidden away for far too long. And while James had promised to protect Elijah from everything that had hurt him, he knew that the road ahead would be filled with difficult choices. What would Elijah want to do with the past that had been revealed to him? What path would he choose? But one thing was clear. Whatever happened next, James would stand by his son. No matter the obstacles, no matter the danger, he would always be there, a constant source of love and support. As James walked down the hallway, he paused at the stairs and looked back at Elijah's room. The light in the boy's room was still on, and James knew that, for now, Elijah would be processing the truth on his own. But one thing was certain: their journey together was far from over. The past had been uncovered, but the future, no matter how uncertain, was theirs to shape. And James would never stop fighting to protect the family he had built. Facing the future. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty for both James and Elijah. James couldn't help but notice the quiet shift in the house. The tension that had settled between them was subtle, but it was there. Elijah had always been a bright, lively presence, full of questions, ideas, and an infectious energy. But now he seemed quieter, withdrawn at times, lost in thought. James respected his need for space, but a part of him ached to reach out, to offer reassurance, to tell Elijah that everything would be okay. But the truth was, James didn't know what the future held. He had always believed that he could protect Elijah from whatever came their way, that their love and the life they had built together would be enough to shield him from the pain of the past. But now, with the truth of Elijah's biological family coming to light, James realized that he couldn't protect him from everything. Some things, some truths, were too big to shield him from. Elijah had asked for time, and James had promised him that. He didn't want to rush him into anything. But James could see the weight of the past on Elijah's shoulders. He could see it in the way his son spent hours staring out of the window, as if searching for answers in the fading light of each day. James couldn't help but wonder if Elijah would ever feel the same about him after learning the truth. Would he still see James as his father, or would the pull of his biological family be too strong to ignore? James knew that Marcus, the man who had haunted the periphery of their lives, was still a danger. The more James thought about it, the more he realized how close they were to something much darker. Marcus hadn't just been a threat to Naomi. He had been a threat to Elijah too. And now that Elijah was older, stronger, and beginning to understand the world around him, James couldn't ignore the reality of what might happen if Marcus ever found out about Elijah's survival. The first step in addressing that fear was understanding Marcus's connection to Elijah's mother, Naomi. The more James dug into the past, the more he realized that Marcus wasn't just some figure from Naomi's life. He was someone tied deeply to the web of violence and fear that had dominated her world. Marcus's criminal connections ran deep, and though James had hoped that the years would have dulled the danger, he knew better than to believe that. The more he uncovered, the more it became clear that Marcus was not the kind of person who simply let things go. It was on the third day after their conversation that James received an unexpected phone call. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the number on the screen. It was from a private investigator he had hired months earlier, someone with the resources and expertise to dig into the criminal network Marcus was connected to. The investigator, a man named Frank, had been working tirelessly to uncover anything that could lead them to Marcus's whereabouts. "Dr. Lawson," Frank's voice was grave as he spoke, "I've got something for you. We've traced Marcus Williams's movements, and it's not good. He's been making moves in the city, and I've just found out something that might change everything." James felt a chill wash over him. "What is it? What did you find?" "There's a family connection," Frank said slowly. "Marcus has a relative, a brother, who's been acting as his proxy in the last few years. The brother, Robert Williams, is currently living in the city under a different name. We think Marcus is planning something big, something that might involve Elijah." James's heart dropped into his stomach. "What do you mean, involve Elijah?" "We're not sure yet," Frank said. "But from what we've pieced together, Robert has been searching for Elijah. He doesn't know who he is exactly, but he's been looking for someone who matches his description. I've been trying to keep an eye on things, but it's becoming clear that Marcus or someone working for him might be getting closer to finding Elijah." James felt a rush of panic surge through him. "What do we do?" "I'll keep tracking them," Frank reassured him. "But for now, I suggest you be extra cautious. Make sure Elijah doesn't go out alone, and don't trust anyone who seems to be following him. It's getting dangerous, and we need to move fast." James hung up the phone, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. The truth about Elijah's past had already changed their lives in ways he hadn't anticipated, but now the very man they had been trying to escape was closing in on them. He knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let Elijah become a pawn in someone else's game, not after everything they had been through together. That evening, after Elijah had finished his homework and was sitting quietly at the dinner table, James knew it was time to have another conversation. This one would be different. There was no longer any room for uncertainty. The danger was real, and it was closer than they had imagined. "Eli," James said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of everything he had learned in the past few days. "We need to talk." Elijah looked up from his plate, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. "What's wrong, Dr. Lawson?" James sat down across from him, his hands clasped in front of him. "You know that everything I've done, everything I've tried to protect you from, has been about keeping you safe, right?" Elijah nodded, his eyes searching James's face, sensing the gravity in his tone. "Of course. You've always had my back." James took a deep breath. "It's not just about your mom or Marcus. It's about something bigger, something dangerous." Elijah's frown deepened. "What do you mean?" "There's a man named Marcus Williams," James began, his voice steady but firm. "He's the one your mom was running from when she left you in the park. He's dangerous, Eli, and he's been looking for you. He's been trying to find you for years." Elijah's face paled. "What? Why?" "Because you're his son," James said softly. "He's your biological father, and he has no idea how much danger you've been in all this time." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. He looked down at his hands, trying to process the information. "But why didn't you tell me this before?" "I didn't want to scare you," James admitted. "But now it's something we have to face. Marcus has people looking for you, Eli, and I need you to understand that we're going to have to be very careful." Elijah swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly. "So what do we do now?" "We protect you," James said, his voice fierce with resolve. "We stay one step ahead of him. And if it comes to it, we fight back. But I want you to know something, Eli. No matter what happens, you're not alone. You have me, and I will never let anything happen to you." Elijah looked up at him then, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "I don't know what I would do without you." "You won't have to find out," James said, his voice filled with unwavering confidence. "I'm not going anywhere." The silence that followed was thick with the weight of everything they had just discussed. But there was something else in the air too, a quiet understanding between father and son. The truth about their past had shaken their world, but it also bound them closer together. They had come through the storm before, and now they would face whatever came next as a team. James knew the road ahead would be difficult. They would have to stay vigilant, keep moving, and remain ahead of Marcus and his dangerous connections. But he also knew that they were ready. They had each other, and nothing would break the bond they had built. For Elijah, there was still so much to process, so much to understand about the family he had never known, and the man who had been hunting him in the shadows. But for now, there was only one thing that mattered. They were in this together, and they would face whatever came their way, side by side. James stood up, offering his hand to Elijah, who took it without hesitation. "We'll get through this," James said, a fierce determination in his eyes. "Together." And with that, they both knew that the future, whatever it held, would be one they would face head-on.